Welcome to another video. Let's begin delving in Wild West.
Jacob Holt had always believed a man was better off expecting nothing from life but weather and work. Weather would turn on you. Work would not. So when he rode down from the high slopes to meet the woman who'd agreed to marry him, without ever seeing his face, he told himself the same thing. He told himself before every snowstorm, "Do not hope, just prepare." The town of Brier Creek lay flat and brown under a sky the color of old tin. Jacob stepped off his horse outside the small white church, brushing trail dust from his coat. He was 33, broad-shouldered, with hands stained by pine pitch and years of swinging an axe. He owned a small cabin, a string of mules, and a stand of timber up on Holt Ridge. It was enough to keep a man alive. Not enough, folks liked to remind him, to make a woman happy. He hadn't asked for happy. But he'd asked the preacher to find him someone willing, a woman who needed a roof, steady food, and a man who would not raise his voice or his hand. Love, he had decided, was something for men with softer lives and fewer winters behind them. Inside the church, she stood by the first pew, turning a small suitcase handle in white-knuckled fingers. Emily Warren. That was the name in the letter. She was younger than he expected, maybe mid-20s, in a plain blue dress that had been mended neat at the cuffs. Brown hair was pinned tight beneath a hat that had seen better days, but her back was straight, and there was a stubborn lift to her chin that did not match the worn edges of her clothes. Jacob paused in the doorway, feeling dust and cold air at his back and lamplight ahead. This was the woman he'd decided to bind his life to. Someone he had never spoken to, whose voice he only knew from a careful, sloping hand in ink. He realized then that, for the first time in years, his heart was beating faster for something that was not danger. "Mr. Holt?" Her voice was softer than he expected, but steady. She did not smile when she said his name. She was measuring him, the way he often measured a tree before taking an axe to it. "Jacob," he said, stepping closer. "You must be Miss Warren." "I suppose that'll change in a few minutes." There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Humor, maybe, or nerves, but it went as quickly as it came. She looked past him to the open door, where the town's main street ran past like a thin, dusty river. "It's quieter than I imagined." "Gets quieter yet on the mountain," he replied. "God, I won't lie to you about that. I did not come looking for noise." She drew a slow breath, as if bracing herself for something only she could see. "The preacher said you were honest. I can live with honest." The words might have been simple, but they struck harder than any compliment. Honest. Not kind, not charming. Honest. Jacob could be that much, at least. Still, he heard the distance in her voice. She had not come for him. Not really. She had come for a place to go that was not whatever lay behind her. The ceremony was small. The preacher mumbled his way through the vows with one eye on the clock, as though hurrying before the clouds outside broke into snow. There were only two witnesses, the preacher's wife and a shopkeeper's boy, who had been sweeping out front. Jacob repeated the words he was given. He promised to provide, to protect, to keep. The word love never sounded from his mouth. It did cross his mind, briefly, that he wasn't sure what it would mean for a man like him. When it was done, Emily slipped her hand into his, the new ring catching a dull flash of light. Her palm was cool, but not trembling. She looked at him the way someone might look at a narrow bridge over a deep canyon, calculating, cautious, but willing to cross because there was no other way. Outside, the wind had sharpened. Jacob helped her onto his horse, Blaze, and tied her small suitcase behind the saddle. She glanced at the single worn bag, then at his mule loaded with supplies, All I am bringing fits in there, she said quietly. That can be a mercy, he answered, before he could stop himself. Yeah, less weight to carry up the mountain. She watched him with a look that said she heard more than the words. Some things weigh plenty, even when you leave them behind. He did not ask what she meant. He had his own things he preferred to leave unspoken. The winter he almost didn't survive. The brother who'd gone east and never written back. The father who taught him that men who wanted too much ended up disappointed and mean. Better to let the trail absorb certain stories. As they rode out of town, Brier Creek did not bother to wave them off. A couple of men on the boardwalk watched with idle curiosity. Jacob heard one say, not quite under his breath, "Poor girl. She'll freeze up there." Emily sat straighter in the saddle at that, jaw tightening. She did not turn around. Jacob did. He met the man's gaze until the other looked away. Is it always like that?" she asked after a moment, eyes fixed on the rutted road ahead. "Folks talk," Jacob said. "They do not know the ridge. They think they know you." He shrugged. "What they know does not keep the stove burning." For several miles they rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the crunch of hooves on hard ground. The land began to rise, sage giving way to stands of pine and rock. The air cooled. Emily's cheeks reddened, but she did not complain. Twice he offered to stop, and twice she shook her head. "You are not what I expected," he said at last. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd ask how long the ride is, or whether there's a proper town near the cabin. Someone who'd hesitate." "I did all my hesitating before I got on that train," she replied. "If I change my mind now, I've nowhere to go back to." That answer settled heavy between them. He felt the urge to ask what exactly she had left. A family? A scandal? A grave? The question rose to his lips more than once, and each time he swallowed it, tasting iron and restraint. As the sun dipped, clouds gathered low and gray over the ridge. The first flakes of snow began to drift down, soft and thin as ash. Jacob glanced at the sky, then at her. "We'll reach the cabin before full dark if we keep on," he said. "It isn't much, but it's dry and warmer than this." "I don't need much," she said. "Just a place no one knows me." That was the closest thing to a confession he'd heard from her yet. There was something in the way she said it, a faint tremor, quickly buried, that made him think of how he'd felt years ago, when he first climbed high enough that town lights vanished behind the hills. Relieved, terrified, free and trapped at once. Night was leaning in when they finally crested the last rise. His cabin came into view, tucked against a line of dark pines, smoke trailing thin from the chimney where he'd left the stove banking low. A single window glowed faintly. It had never looked smaller to him than it did with a wife sitting behind him on the saddle. Emily drew in a breath. "So, this is it. This is it," he said. "Home." She slid down from the horse and stood staring at the cabin, her expression unreadable in the half-light. Then he saw her eyes catch on something by the door. An old carving in the beam, 2 initials crossed together, weathered but still clear enough to read. Her gaze shifted back to him, sharp and searching, and as the wind rose and the snow began to fall in earnest. "You never mentioned," she said quietly, "that someone was here before me." Jacob's first instinct was to step in front of the carving, as if his shoulders could hide weathered wood, but the initials were already in her eyes, pressed there as surely as into the beam. J+L. The letters crossed in a clumsy heart he'd carved with a hunting knife long ago. He cleared his throat. "Old Mark, from before the cabin was finished." "That much I gathered." Emily's voice was calm, but her fingers tightened around the small suitcase. What I don't know is why you didn't mention it. Snow blew sideways now, speckling her hat and coat. Jacob felt the cold slipping in around them, like it was looking for a place to stay. Because it doesn't matter anymore, he said. The words came out sharper than he meant. Come inside. Storm's settling in for the night. For a second, he thought she might refuse. She stood there, studying him like he was the stranger, not the mountain. Then she lifted her chin, walked past him, and stepped through the door into his life. The cabin swallowed them with a wave of dry heat and the faint smell of pine smoke. It was small, one room, plus a lean-to pantry, a iron stove in the corner, table with 2 chairs, the bed against the far wall, blankets folded tight, shelves lined with tools, tins, and a few worn books. Emily stopped just inside, her eyes roaming the space. Jacob watched her notice everything. The extra chair, the quilt at the foot of the bed, stitched with small, careful flowers he hadn't put there himself, the chipped blue cup hanging from a hook by the stove. Your wife's things? She asked. I don't have a wife, he said. Not until today. She glanced back toward the door, where the initials waded out in the snow. No, I suppose you don't. He set her suitcase near the bed, suddenly aware of how bare the room truly was. When it was only him, it had felt sufficient. Now it looked like a place a man lived when he expected no one to witness it. I'll sleep by the fire, he said, moving to tug a rolled blanket from a shelf. You take the bed. She frowned. That's not necessary. It's not a matter of necessary, or it's a matter of decency. Something in her eased at that, just slightly. All right, she said. Thank you. He busied himself with the stove, feeding in more wood. Snow tapped at the window glass, the sound light, but insistent. Emily removed her gloves, laying them near the stove to dry, then unpinned her hat. Her hair, freed from its tight prison, fell in a loose, uneven roll down her back. How long have you lived up here? She asked. 7 winters, he said. 8, if this one decides to stay. Alone. It wasn't a question. He gave a small nod. Most folks wouldn't call that living, just staying above ground. And the L? She asked quietly. Did she decide she couldn't? The question found him unprepared. He shifted a log with the poker, watching. Sparks jump like arguments he didn't want to have. She decided something else, he said. Sit. You're shaking. I'm fine. But she did sit, perching on the edge of the chair like she might spring out of it at any second. The fire painted her face in soft orange light, making the worry lines around her mouth look deeper, the determination in her eyes clearer. You said you wanted honest, he said, setting the poker down. Honest is, I carved those letters for someone once, years back. We were supposed to be married before the roof went on. She changed her mind. That's all. Just like that? He let out a low breath. Not just like anything. Took her months to make herself say it. Took me longer to hear it. Emily's gaze moved slowly around the cabin again. The extra chair, the flowered quilt, the little blue cup. And you kept it all. It was already here, he said. Didn't see the point in throwing away what still worked. You didn't see the point, she repeated softly, as if testing the shape of the words. He heard the judgment there, or thought he did. His jaw tightened. Up here, you learn not to rip down a wall because of who helped nail it. Cold doesn't care about memories. People do, she said. Silence settled between them, heavy as another log on the fire. Outside, the wind raised its voice, shouldering against the cabin walls. I didn't bring you here to live in another woman's shadow, Jacob said at last. If I thought that's what this was, I would have taken a knife to that carving long ago. Why didn't you?" He opened his mouth, then shut it again. He'd asked himself that same thing on more than one lonely night. What the answer he'd never quite said out loud was that the carving reminded him of foolishness, of what came from wanting too much. It had become less a memory of her, and more a warning to himself. "Because it reminds me what promises can turn into," he said finally. "And I figured it's better to remember that than forget." Emily's hands folded in her lap. The knuckles were as white as they'd been in the church. "Seems we both came up this mountain with ghosts then." He studied her. "You said you wanted a place no one knew you." "I did. Is there a man somewhere carving your initials into a doorframe?" A faint, humorless smile crossed her face. "No. If he carved anything, it would be a ledger, with numbers, and my name near the bottom." Jacob frowned. "Debt?" "Not mine." She looked down at her hands. "My father's. And he lost more than he had, and the man holding the paper decided I would even the account." Heat rose in Jacob's chest, different from the stove's. "He tried to sell you off." "It sounds uglier said plain," she murmured. "But yes, he called it securing my future. Said the man had a fine house in town, a name that mattered, and no reason to say no. Except that I did." She lifted her eyes to his. "Steady now. The day they set the date, I went to the preacher instead. Asked if there was anyone who needed a wife more than a showpiece. And he told you about me." Jacob's voice was rough. "He said you were hard but fair, that you kept to yourself, that you didn't drink too much, didn't hit, didn't swear in front of women." Her mouth twisted in a humorless half-smile. "He did not mention the door." Jacob exhaled slowly. But the room felt smaller still, full of past promises made, and broken on both sides. "I expected a cold marriage," he said. "Not cruel, just practical. Two people who needed the same thing, and could share a roof without asking more than that." "And now?" Her question was quiet. He looked at her, truly looked, past the plain dress and the travel-tired face, at the woman who had boarded a train alone rather than let her name become someone's payment, at the straightness of her back, the way she'd watched him in town when the men on the boardwalk spoke. "Now," he said slowly, "I'm not sure what to expect." Her eyes flickered, something unguarded shining through before she dropped her gaze. "Uncertainty is not very comforting, Mr. Holt." "Jacob," he said, "you're my wife. You can call me by my name." The word wife hung between them like steam in winter air, surprising them both. A sudden gust shook the cabin, making the window rattle in its frame. Emily startled, hand flying to the back of the chair. "Just the wind finding its voice," Jacob said. "It does that when it knows snow's coming heavy." "It sounds like it's trying to get in," she admitted. "It already has." He nodded toward the door. "We let it in with us, but it won't bite. I'll shore the shutters." He pulled on his coat and stepped back out into the swirling white, latching the shutters tight, checking the roof line by lantern light. When he came back in, his beard was dusted with snow, his shoulders with cold. Emily was standing by the bed, fingertips grazing the edge of the quilt. On the small shelf beside it sat a wooden box he hadn't thought about in months. Its lid was open now, the dried wildflowers inside exposed to the room like an old wound turned outward. Her voice reached him before he could speak. "You kept these, too." "They were hers," he said, "from the first spring we spent up here. She brought them in like they were treasure. I didn't have the heart to throw them out after she left." Emily touched one brittle petal, then drew her hand back as if it might sting. "You say it doesn't matter, but you live in the middle of it." He felt a flicker of anger then, not at her, but at the truth of it. With a life behind you, Same as me. Though with a life behind you. Same as me. The question is whether we're going to stand in each other's pasts or build something that belongs to now. She looked up at him, eyes bright in the firelight. For a heartbeat, the storm outside forgot to howl. "And can you do that?" she asked, "with someone else's name carved over your door?" He swallowed. The image rose unbidden, a knife in his hand, wood curling away in pale ribbons, the past disappearing one careful cut at a time. It would be simple work, harder to explain why it had taken him so long. "I can," he said, "if it matters to you." Her gaze searched his face, as if weighing whether he meant it. "Yeah, you look at me. You see the life you look at me. You see the life you wanted, or the life you settled for." The stove crackled. The wind pressed its palms against the walls, testing for weakness. Jacob had faced rock slides, blizzards, and nights so cold the air hurt to breathe, but he had never felt as off balance as he did under that question. He opened his mouth, the answer tangled somewhere between habit and hope, and in that moment, the lantern flickered, the room dipped into shadow, and the mountain night closed in around them, waiting to hear what he would say. The lantern steadied instead of dying, throwing a nervous halo over the room. Jacob let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Some things, and it seemed, still chose to hold on. "I don't see the life I settled for," he said at last, voice low. "I see the life I didn't think I had any right to ask for." Emily's fingers tightened on the back of the chair. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said. "You climbed a mountain to keep your name your own. You looked those men in town in the eye without flinching. You haven't complained once since we left the road. If I had been choosing for comfort alone, I wouldn't have asked for that woman." He watched the words land. For a moment, he thought he'd pushed too hard. Then something inside her seemed to loosen, like a knot pulled once too tight, being allowed a little slack. "It's not comfort I'm afraid of," she said quietly. "It's being invisible in my own house." "You won't be invisible here," Jacob said. There's not enough room." The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. Outside, the wind howled again, but it sounded different now. Less like a threat, and more like a fact they both accepted. "Then start with the door," she said, "if we're to be honest." He nodded. Without another word, he took the hunting knife from its hook and stepped back out into the storm. Snow came at him sideways, stinging his face. He lifted the lantern, its light swinging over the carved heart. J+L. He remembered the day he'd cut those lines. Spring sunlight, her laughter, his own certainty that some things were permanent. The memory rose like smoke, sharp and bitter. "Thank you," he said under his breath. Not to her, exactly, but to the warning the carving had become. Then he set the tip of the knife to the wood and began to work. The wind stole the shavings as fast as he made them, carrying pale curls of their old life off into the dark. He didn't erase the wood entirely, just enough that the heart blurred. The letters lost their shape. When he finished, his hands were stiff with cold, and the beam bore only the faint, scarred memory of what had been. Inside, Emily stood waiting by the stove, arms wrapped around herself. He hung the knife back on its hook. "It's gone," he said. "Is it?" she asked. "I can't rip out the beam," he replied. "But no one passing will know a name was ever there. Not unless I tell them." "And will you?" He thought of the way the preacher's wife had looked at Emily in the church, the quick flicker of pity, the assumption that any woman taking Jacob Holt's name must be desperate or foolish. "No," he said. "Why, what I had before is mine to remember or forget. It's not your burden." Her shoulders dropped a fraction, as if a weight he couldn't see had shifted. "All right," she said. "Then I suppose we'd better learn how to share this room without tripping over ghosts." They did not solve it that night. They didn't suddenly fall into easy conversation or easy silence. Emily lay on the bed, turned toward the wall. Jacob stretched out on the pallet by the fire, listening to the wind argue with the roof, to the small shifts of her breathing. Sleep, when it came, was thin. Once, near dawn, he woke to the sound of her muffled cry. He sat up, muscles tensed, but she had already rolled onto her back, eyes open in the dim light. "Just a dream," she said. "Go back to sleep." He didn't. Days found their own rhythm. Jacob rose before light. He stoked the stove, broke ice in the water bucket. Emily learned the feel of the place quickly, where the floor creaked, how much wood the stove liked, how to brace the door so the wind didn't rattle it off its hinges. She moved carefully at first, as if the cabin might reject her. But soon, her touch began to show in small ways. The bed made with the corners tucked tighter, the dishes stacked in some order only she understood, the single wildflower she placed in a tin cup when the storm eased enough for her to walk to the tree line and pick it. "You'll get more when the thaw comes," Jacob said, watching her set the fragile stem beside the window. "If I'm still here," she replied lightly, but her fingers lingered on the cup a moment longer than the words needed. They spoke more in fragments than speeches. He told her about the ridge, where the snow melted last, and the pines dropped cones big as his hand. She told him about late nights in her father's shop, counting coins that never added up right, listening to men talk about her future as if she were a chair to be moved from one room to another. "You could have stayed," he said one evening as they shared a pot of stew. "Taken the fine house, the name that mattered." She blew on her spoon. "Names matter a lot less when they think you're part of the furniture that came with them." "But your father, my father made his choices," she said. "I decided to make mine before he spent those too." He heard the steel under the words and found he respected it more than any softness. Still, a question tugged at him, persistent as the draft under the door. "Do you ever regret it?" She studied him for a long beat. Ask me again after the winter," she said. It might have stayed that way, two people circling the edges of something warmer, if not for the day the past climbed the mountain. It was late afternoon when Jacob saw the figure on the trail below, a dark speck moving slow but steady through the snow. Visitors were rare. He set down his axe, narrowed his eyes. The gait was not of a man used to the slope. "Someone's coming," he called toward the cabin. Emily stepped out, apron still in her hand. Her face drained of color as soon as she recognized the coat. The fine black wool, too clean for this country. The hat pulled low over calculating eyes. "Elias Marlowe," she said, barely above a whisper. "The man with the ledger," Jacob guessed. "The man with the paper," she replied. Marlowe reached the yard huffing, cheeks red with exertion. "On us all quite a scare." "That is not my us all quite a scare." "That is not my name," Emily said, "and we both know it was never going to be." Jacob stepped closer, placing himself half a step ahead of her without thinking. "You climbed a long way for someone who was left at the altar," he said. "Business requires effort," Marlowe replied crisply. "Miss Warren and I had an understanding, a debt to be settled. Then I hear she's run off to marry some mountain recluse." His gaze swept Jacob's clothes, the cabin, with visible distaste. "Your understanding was with her father," Jacob said, "not with her." "The paper bears the family name," Marlowe said, looking past him to Emily. "And that name still owes. I won't force you back, Emily. I'm not a monster, but I will have what's due, one way or another." The words dropped into the cold air like stones into a well. Emily stepped out from behind Jacob. Her shoulders were stiff, but her voice did not shake. "You had interest," she said. "Every conversation, every reminder of what you'd done for us, every look that said I should be grateful. And I will not pay you with my life on top of that." "Fine principles," Marlowe said. "But principles don't put food on a table. I gave your father money. Everything he owned isn't worth half what you're living in now." His eyes landed on the stack of split wood, the mules, the sturdy walls. Jacob felt something hot rise in his chest. "This place isn't on your ledger," Jacob said evenly. "You won't carry it back down the mountain." Marlowe smiled thinly. "No, but the law may see it different once I show them how a poor shopkeeper's daughter walked straight into a man's well-prepared arms." He looked from one to the other. "They'll say you helped her steal from me, Mr. Holt." Jacob had never thought much about law beyond what kept men from shooting each other in the street. But he knew enough to picture Marlowe in a judge's ear. "What is owed?" "Principal." "Interest." "Whatever is owed." "Principal." "Interest." "Whatever name you want to give it. Then you'll go back down this mountain, and I'll pay it out as I can, in timber, in coin, in whatever work a man's back can give." Emily stared at him. "Jacob." He didn't look at her, eyes locked on Marlowe. "You wanted debt paid. You'll have it. But you'll have no claim on her name. Not now. Not later." Marlowe considered, weighing greed against pride. "And if I refuse?" Jacob stepped forward until the tips of their boots nearly touched. His voice stayed calm, but there was iron under it. "Then you walk away with nothing but sore legs, and the knowledge that every man in Brier Creek will hear how you chased a woman up a mountain, trying to turn her into currency." For the first time, doubt flickered in Marlowe's eyes. Reputation mattered to men like him as much as money did. Slowly, he reached into his coat, drew out a folded paper, and a pencil from his inner pocket. He scribbled, the numbers scratching against the cold air, then thrust the sheet at Jacob. "There," he said. "You have 3 years. After that, I take it to town." Jacob took the paper and did not look at the figure. "You'll have your first payment next time I come down with my timber." Marlowe turned to Emily one last time. "You think you've won yourself a storybook ending," he said, "but men grow bitter under weight like this. Well, remember that." She met his gaze without flinching. "I'd rather face a hard winter with someone who sees me as a person than a mild summer as someone's collateral." Marlowe snorted, pulled his collar up, and started down the trail. The mountain swallowed him step by step. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Snow whispered off the pines. "You shouldn't have done that," Emily said finally. "It's my ridge," Jacob answered. "My debt, if that's the price of you not being his." She shook her head. "That's not how numbers work." "I don't much care how numbers work," he said quietly. "I care how we do." They stood there, 2 figures in the snow with a future newly complicated. She looked at the paper still clenched in his fist, then at the cabin behind them, small, weathered, stubborn as the man who'd built it. "This isn't the cold. The Loveless arrangement you planned," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. And you may come to resent that." "I might," he said. "I might resent every log I cut to pay a man who doesn't deserve it. But I won't resent the reason." His eyes met hers, steady. "I'd rather wear myself out paying for your freedom than live easy knowing you'd been bought with mine." The words seemed to take something out of him. He dropped his gaze as if he'd said too much. Emily stepped closer, snow crunching under her boots. She reached for the paper, folded it in half, then in half again, until it was small enough to disappear into her palm. "Then we'll pay it," she said. "Together. Not because he owns us, because we chose to be free of him." "Together," he echoed. She slipped the folded note into the pocket of her dress, yet then looked past him to the cabin. Through the window, the single room glowed warm against the gray sky. She saw the bed, the stove, the shelf with the closed wooden box, and the blank, scarred beam just beyond. "When I got on that train," she said, "I told myself I was trading one prison for another, just a different kind of walls. And now?" She took a breath of thin, cold air that seemed to fill her all the way down. "Now, I'm not sure what I walked into," she admitted. "But for the first time in a long while, I'd like to stay long enough to find out." The wind shifted, carrying away the last echo of Marlowe's boots on the trail. Jacob held the door for her. She stepped inside first this time, not as someone taking shelter in a stranger's house, but as someone crossing her own threshold. Behind her, Jacob paused, an hand resting for a moment on the place where old letters had been carved and cut away. His palm pressed against scarred wood, feeling not the loss, but the strength still holding the cabin upright. He followed her in, closing the door on the storm, on the town below, on the lives they'd both walked away from. The mountain would not grow kinder. The debt would not disappear. Winters would still come hard and long. But as Emily moved about the small room, setting another place at the table, straightening the quilt, leaving her hat hanging from a peg that had once been empty, he felt something new settle over the cabin. Not the old, heavy silence of a man waiting for disappointment, but a quieter uncertainty, the kind that left room for warmth to grow, slowly, like a fire coaxed from stubborn kindling. He had prepared for a cold, loveless marriage on the mountain. Instead, standing there watching her, Jacob realized he had stepped into something far more dangerous. The fragile, frightening hope that this life, this woman, this cabin, this hard, narrow ridge, might yet become the very thing he'd taught himself never to expect. And for the first time in years, he did not push that hope away.